When you think about mixed martial arts, in terms of its history, it's relatively new compared to other sports, but in the short time that it's been around in this current form, there have been plenty of amazing, shocking moments that have really taken our breath away. I'm Joe Hendry from What Culture MMA, and this is the 8 most shocking moments in MMA history. In at number 8, it's the Nashville Brawl. This was back in the Strikeforce days, and Jake Shields had just got done defeating Dan Henderson, at which point Jason Mayhem Miller thought it would be a great idea to jump the cage and confront Jake Shields, asking, "When am I going to get my rematch, buddy?" Well, if you know anything about Jake Shields, you'll know which camp he comes from, and you'll know that camp contains the Diaz brothers, and you do not want to be upsetting the Diaz brothers inside a cage. That didn't go too well for Jason Mayhem Miller, because an all-out brawl ensued, which resulted in him being held down and getting beaten up. Miller, along with 5 other guilty parties, were fined thousands of dollars, but Strikeforce did decide that there perhaps was some interest in seeing Miller face off against, say, Nick Diaz. Now, they did try to set the fight up, but Zuffa purchased Strikeforce, and unfortunately, it wasn't to be, but it still provided us with a shocking moment. In at number 7, Paul Daley attacks Josh Koscheck after the bell. Now, if you remember this fight, there had been a lot of trash talk going into it, as Josh Koscheck always likes to do. And in this fight, Koscheck had managed to completely neutralise the offense of Paul Daley, which was an even more frustrating situation. As a result, once the fight had finished, Paul Daley decided to attack Josh Koscheck, getting out his frustrations, but in the process, managing to get him banned from the UFC. Now, Dana White has been known to go back on his word a few times when it comes to these ultimatums, but there doesn't seem like any sign of this one budging at all, because despite the fact that Paul Daley has been a top level welterweight fighter, there doesn't seem like there's any chance of him coming back to the UFC anytime soon. The reason this was so shocking is because although we've seen many intense situations and some unsportsmanlike behaviour, this was perhaps the worst. In at number 6, Michael Bisping wins the World Championship. Now, we know that Michael Bisping is a top level athlete, so the fact that he would win a world title isn't what's surprising. It's the circumstances that he did it in that make it such a shocking moment, because if you'll remember, Luke Rockhold was set to face Chris Weidman, and Weidman had to pull out due to injury. In steps Michael Bisping, who'd been filming a movie in Canada on 17 days notice. Many people wrote Michael Bisping off completely, and they felt that because of the short notice and the fact that he wasn't in the prime of his career, he was at the tail end of his career, they didn't think that he could defeat a seemingly unstoppable Luke Rockhold, who had this sublime confidence. But perhaps that sublime confidence led him to underestimate Michael Bisping, who proved that sometimes being a champion is a ruthless execution of the basics. And he did exactly that when Luke Rockhold brought his hands down and perhaps got overconfident. Michael Bisping has long been one of the biggest stars in the UFC, but truly a lot of fans felt that he was never going to get that championship title win, that moment. And it was fantastic that he was able to do it against such a credible opponent and do it on short notice. It was an unbelievable and shocking achievement. In at number 5, Brock Lesnar returns at UFC 200. Now, Brock Lesnar being announced for the UFC in his first run was a shocking moment, but it was even more shocking when he returned for UFC 200, because the card was in trouble. John Jones wasn't able to compete against Daniel Cormier, and they just lost a huge bout from the card. In steps Brock Lesnar to give us that amazing fight that we didn't know we needed to see, which was Brock Lesnar versus Mark Hunt. And the reason it was also shocking was because Lesnar was at the time under contract to WWE, who allowed him to go back and compete in the UFC, providing us with a fight that we never knew we'd be able to have. In at number 4, Matt Serra upsets GSP to win the welterweight championship of the world. If you go all the way back to The Ultimate Fighter Season 4, you'll remember that the premise of this season was to give some floundering careers an opportunity to get right back to the top, to give someone an opportunity against one of the greatest of all time, Georges St-Pierre. Matt Serra went on to the season, and truth be told, people felt that the skill difference was too high, the physical difference was too great, that Matt Serra wouldn't be able to overcome GSP. Now, admittedly, GSP says at the time he had got overconfident and perhaps had rested on on his laurels, and as a result, Matt Serra was able to knock out GSP and become the champion as a massive underdog. Number 3, UFC 151 gets cancelled. If you'll remember, the scheduled bout was supposed to be Jon Jones defending against Dan Henderson, who was unfortunately removed due to injury. In steps Chael Sonnen, who offers to fight Jon Jones, but Jon Jones' camp declines to take the fight because they didn't want to take a fight against a wrestler of the caliber of Chael Sonnen on that short notice, and Dana White was not happy. The reason he wasn't happy was because they then had to cancel completely UFC 151, which was strange because of the way that the events are numbered. They had to go from UFC 150 to UFC 152. Because the events are marketed so far in advance, it didn't make sense to shift all of the events, so they just decided that UFC 151 would cease to exist. It would be a ghost. They just decided that the best thing to do would be to remove UFC 151 from the history books altogether, and it is to this day an anomaly in the UFC numbered system. In at number 2, Fedor loses. In June 2010, Fedor went up against Fabricio Werdum and was going in with a record of 31-1-1, including only one loss in his entire storied career. He hadn't lost in a decade and was in contention for being the best pound-for-pound fighter ever. This was shortly after Dana White had tried to sign that ultra fight that could have been, which was Brock Lesnar versus Fedor himself. Dana White wasn't able to do the deal, but he reminded Fedor that he was just one punch away from losing his worth. Unfortunately, Fedor went on to lose 3 in a row before rebuilding his record back up. Everyone can be beaten, but it seemed that that rule just didn't apply when it came to Fedor, which was why it was so shocking when Fabricio Werdum managed to get the submission. And in at number 1, what we feel is the most shocking moment in MMA. HOLM upsets Ronda Rousey. The reason that this was so shocking is because Ronda Rousey was at the time arguably the biggest star in the UFC, and she had been the leader in the women's MMA movement. Before Ronda, there hadn't been women's MMA inside the UFC, and at this point it had become a total priority. That's why it was such a huge shock, because Ronda had been so dominant and just crushing all challenges in her path. We hadn't even seen her being in trouble or tested in seemingly any way, and that's why the way that she was knocked out was such a shocking moment. HOLM managed to pick her apart using her distance and her reach, and she managed to kick her with such force that with one kick, HOLM altered the course of women's MMA forever. Ronda Rousey's career in MMA never recovered. Never say never. We might see Ronda back, and we hope that we do, but that to us was the most shocking moment in mixed martial arts. If you feel that we've missed anything out, please let us know in the comments section below, and make sure to like, share and subscribe as well. We would love to have you back. And make sure you stop off at whatculture.com for all your favourite news, reviews, articles, features and so much more. I've been Joe Hendry. We hope you've enjoyed this video, and we shall see you next time.